Renting that chalet seemed like the perfect decision. I needed a few days away from the city to focus on writing, and after a lot of research, I found an isolated place, surrounded by a dense forest, with no neighbors nearby. The dirt road that led there was winding and full of holes, but when I arrived, the view compensated for the effort. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the wind between the trees and the occasional pop of the wood on the balcony. The first night was quiet. I worked late, writing on the laptop, and went to sleep satisfied with the progress. On the second night, however, something started to bother me. I was on the balcony, having a coffee and trying to organize the ideas, when I noticed a faint glow between the trees. At first, I thought it was a reflection of some animal, maybe the eyes of a deer capturing the moonlight. But I soon realized that the lights were flashing strangely, as if they were flashlights being turned on and off. The detail that made me uneasy was that, according to the owner, there were no other cabins in the area. I stayed there for a few minutes, watching, waiting for some movement, but nothing happened. After a while, I decided to ignore it and went back inside. I closed the curtains and tried to convince myself that it was just a strange effect of the light in the middle of the forest. Still feeling a strange discomfort, I decided to check the cabin's security cameras. The owner had mentioned that the place had a simple monitoring system with a camera facing the balcony, so I opened the app on my phone and moved the recording back to the moment I saw the lights. What appeared on the screen made me cold. In the corner of the video, on the edge of the forest, a dark figure was standing still. I couldn't see details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person standing, facing in the direction of the cabin. The most disturbing thing was that the figure didn't move. He stayed there for a time that seemed absurd, whole minutes without any displacement, without even changing his posture. He didn't walk, he didn't gesture, he just watched. I went back to the video earlier that night, trying to find out how long it had been there. My breathing became heavy when I realized that, already in the first moments of twilight, the figure was there. Quiet, patient, waiting. I looked out the window, with my heart racing, but on the outside everything seemed normal. No sign of the lights, no figure among the trees. Even so, I closed the curtains and locked the door harder. I tried to write again, but the image in the video wouldn't leave my head. Who would be there, standing, on the edge of the forest? The place was too remote for casual visitors. Besides, why would someone stay so long without moving, just watching? Whatever it was still nearby. And somehow, he knew I was looking back. The dawn was advancing, and the silence inside the cabin was almost absolute. Only the weak sound of the wind passing through the trees filled the space. I tried to convince myself that it was some lost hunter, or at most, a curious resident of the region. But something in the way that figure simply stood still made me doubt any logical explanation. I decided to check the camera again. When I opened the app, I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was no longer there. The time between my last check and that moment was a maximum of 15 minutes. Someone, or something, had moved fast. I was completely still, listening to any sign of movement outside. Nothing. Just the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. The tension was growing inside me until an idea occurred to me. The camera didn't just have live recording. It also had a motion sensor that recorded small pieces of video when something passed through the field of vision. I went to the recent files and found a new recording made a few minutes ago. I pressed play. The screen showed the image of the empty balcony, illuminated only by the dim light of the moon. A few seconds passed without anything happening. Then suddenly, a head emerged from the corner of the screen. My body froze. Someone, or something, sneaked slowly into the image, advancing with a disturbing calm. He had approached the cabin. The figure stopped right on the edge of the balcony, facing directly to the camera. The face was covered by shadows, but I could feel the eyes watching me. And then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. The video ended there. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was going to explode. I closed the app and walked away from my cell phone, my mind spinning between fear and disbelief. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't paranoia. Someone was on my balcony while I was in there. I took my backpack without thinking twice. In less than 5 minutes, he was in the car, starting the engine with his hands shaking. I looked at the panel camera while maneuvering to get out of there. And for a second, maybe a trick of my mind, I thought I saw something moving on the tree line, watching me leave. I didn't wait to find out. I drove all night, without looking back. We've always been adventurous. Daniel, Lucas and I love to explore little-known places, and when a local told us about an ancient hunting trail hidden in the woods, we didn't think twice. He mentioned that few use the path these days, but assured that the landscape was worth the walk. We started the trail at the end of the morning, following the old man's instructions. To avoid getting lost, we leave small red ribbons tied to the tree branches and mark the route with the cell phone's GPS. The path was narrow, with tall trees and exposed roots, and as we advanced, the forest seemed more closed, muffled. After a couple of hours, we began to notice something strange. Among the branches and bushes, there were hanging objects, old, torn and dirty clothes, some childish. Cloth dolls blackened by time swayed with the wind. At first, we thought someone had forgotten that there or that it was some local superstition, but the amount began to bother us. Some clothes looked recent, without so much wear. "That's weird," Lucas murmured, kicking a plastic bottle thrown on the floor. Daniel laughed, trying to relieve the tension. "Maybe someone used this trail as a camp?" I wasn't convinced. The feeling that we were being watched intensified. That's when we decided to go back. When we turned to retrace the path, something was different. The red ribbons we had tied were no longer there. "No, it can't be," I murmured, feeling my chest tighten. Lucas pulled out his cell phone to check the GPS, but the signal was oscillating, and the map indicated that we were at a point with no defined trail. "That's impossible. We came this way." But the way back didn't seem the same anymore. The environment seemed more closed, the trees denser, as if the forest had swallowed the trail. That's when we heard a dry snap. Something, or someone, was close. "Run," I whispered, without even looking back. We shot through the bust, trying to find any reference of the original route. We heard heavy steps following ours, but never close enough to see who or what was there. We only stopped when we saw an old wooden fence. None of us remembered it, but it was the first construction we saw in hours. We went over it, ignoring the rusty wires, and finally saw the road. No one said anything until we got to the car. We started the engine and left without looking back. Only the next day, when we opened the GPS again, we realized the absurdity of all that. Our initial trail ended at a point well before where we found the fence. Whatever diverted us took us to a path that wasn't on the maps. My friend Diego and I have always had the habit of hiking and camping, but this experience was different from everything we've ever lived. We chose a forest reserve away from the city, known for its diverse fauna, perfect for the photos we planned to take. We arrived in the late afternoon, found a clearing, and set up our tent near a small stream. The night fell quickly, and the silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of animals. We had something quick for dinner, and soon we went into the tent to sleep, exhausted from the walk. But what started as a quiet night soon turned into something disturbing. I woke up in the middle of the night with the strange feeling that something was different. I didn't hear any specific sound at first, but there was that uncomfortable restlessness, as if something was watching us. A few minutes later, Diego also woke up and was silent, listening. That's when we heard footsteps. Slow, firm steps circling our tent. The strangest detail was that they didn't seem to belong to an animal. They were too rhythmic, too heavy. We were paralyzed, listening to that for several minutes, trying to convince ourselves that it could be the wind or our imagination playing tricks. But then, out of nowhere, the sound stopped mid. The silence returned, this time denser than before. After a while, without hearing anything else, Diego whispered that we should take a look. We took our flashlights, took a deep breath, and opened the tent carefully. The forest looked exactly like before, except for one detail that made my stomach turn. Right next to our tent, someone or something had stacked small stones in a perfect circle. The strangest thing was that we hadn't seen these stones before, and we certainly hadn't arranged them that way. We illuminated the surroundings, trying to find any sign of who could have done that, but there were no footprints or any other indication that someone was there. It was as if those stones had simply appeared. We stood for a while, trying to decide what to do. We shouted a few times to see if there was someone else camping nearby, but no one answered. The air was heavy, and the forest seemed denser than before, as if it were oppressing us. Without any logical explanation for what was happening, we decided to go back to the tent and wait until dawn. But sleeping after that was impossible. Every little crack of the forest made us hold our breath, and each gust of wind seemed to carry something invisible next to it. We just wanted the night to end soon. The next morning, the weather was tense. We decided that we were going to return home as soon as possible. But before we dismantled the camp, we did one last inspection in the areas around the tent. That's when I realized something that made me freeze inside. Our footprints, which had previously been clearly visible on the soft floor, had completely disappeared. There was no sign that we had left there during the night. We tried to find some logical explanation like the wind, but that didn't explain what we saw the night before. The footprints were simply no longer there, as if we had never been there. But the most terrifying was yet to come. In the middle of all this, I noticed something strange near the entrance of our tent. A third pair of footprints, and they weren't ours. They were footprints of boots, big, heavy, that seemed to have been made recently. The worst thing was that they didn't take us anywhere. They just seemed to start and end suddenly, as if the owner of the boots had simply stopped there. There was no clue of who he was or how he got there. My body was paralyzed, and a feeling of dread took over me. I looked at Diego, and he was as white as I was. We had no way to explain what was happening, but we knew it wasn't something normal. Without wasting any more time, we began to dismantle the camp as soon as possible. Every second, I felt as if we were being watched. The silence of the forest seemed even more oppressive than before. Diego tried to stay calm, but I noticed that his hands were shaking as he folded the tent. I threw my backpack on my back and looked around once more. Something inside me said that we shouldn't be there, that we had to leave immediately. As we walked back to the main trail, we took care to follow our own tracks, but every few meters I looked back hoping or fearing to see something. After almost an hour of walking, we finally reached the point where we had left the car. As soon as we enter, we instinctively locked the doors. While Diego was running the engine, I looked at the trail where we had left. And that's when I saw it. A few meters away, among the trees, a figure was standing still. You couldn't see the face, just the dark silhouette of someone wearing something that looked like a thick coat and boots. The same feeling of absolute terror ran through my body. But before I could say anything, Diego stepped on the accelerator, and we left there as soon as possible. We drove in silence for several minutes, both breathing heavily, trying to process what we had just seen. When we finally arrived at a busier area, we parked on the side of the road to catch our breath. Diego looked at me, still speechless, and just shook his head. I took my cell phone, and, not knowing exactly what to look for, I tried to research about the reservation. There was nothing about similar incidents, nothing about people living illegally in the forest, nothing that explained what happened to us that night. Since that day, I've never camped again. Diego also avoided talking about the subject, as if he wanted to bury the memory. But sometimes I find myself reliving that moment, the silhouette standing among the trees, the strange footprints around the camp, the feeling that we were not alone. The only thing I know is that whoever, or what, was there with us that night let us go, and I prefer not to know the reason.